All right. So our topic is what is toxic leadership and what can be done to minimize its harm? And our group members are Jack Harlock,
Sajiva.
Huzafa Ali.
And Pavi Vijayaraja.
First off, we're going to explain the basics and what is toxic leadership. Toxic leadership is a style of leadership that is marked by destructive, unethical, and abusive behaviors. It is a leadership style that harms the individuals, teams, and organizations. In this slide, we have included five dimensions of toxic leadership. One, self-promotion, abusive supervision, unpredictability, narcissism, and authoritarianism. For self-promotion, the toxic leadership will often take credit for the team's and employees' success. For abusive supervision, toxic leaders will abuse their employees by publicly humiliating and emotionally abusing their staff. Toxic leadership often involves abusive behaviors towards employees. This can include yelling, belittling, and insulting employees. As Barbara Kellerman, author of Bad Leadership, explains, toxic leaders are abusive, volatile, and mean-spirited. They treat people badly. For unpredictability, toxic leaders can be very confusing, very warm, and welcoming at one point, but then completely switch to a cruel and vicious leadership style. They may engage in unethical behavior such as lying, cheating, and stealing. This can create a culture of dishonesty and erode and trust in the organization. As Bill George, former CEO of Medtronic and author, says, the first responsibility of a leader is to set ethical standards for the organization. When people see you doing that, they will follow. For narcissism, toxic leaders can have an unrealistic view of themselves and their own toxic leadership skills and ideas. As a famous author, Simon Sinek, and leadership expert says, leadership is not about being in charge, but it's about taking care of those in your charge. Toxic leaders are very well known to micromanage their employees, which means they will take no other ideas from employees and look at their way of doing things, the only and correct, effective way.
All right, so here we have some quotes about toxic leadership. The first two are from Colonel George E. Reed, with the first one saying that like it's all about the ends and nothing is said about the means. And your bosses, they only know how to use the stick, and there's no sign of the carrot, of course, referring to the way of controlling a donkey with this hitting it versus rewarding it. This essentially breaks it down into toxic leaders are only concerned about the results. They don't care how they get those results. They only want the results, but you will never be rewarded for the results. You'll only be punished for not providing them. Colonel Reed's other quote defines three key elements of toxic leadership being an apparent lack of concern for the well being of their subordinates, a personality or interpersonal technique that negatively affects organizational climate, and a conviction by subordinates that the leader is motivated primarily by self-interest.
How to spot a toxic leadership trait? So some toxic leadership traits would be lying and inconsistent expectations, doesn't listen to criticism, insults in like in a way of advising them, lack of discrimination against employees, focus on hierarchy, so they always look at the people on top over the employees who work under them, nepotism and bullying. Effects that leadership can have within a workplace is it promotes workplace bullying, depression, burn down employees, psychological distress, safety damage, and high over turnover rates, team dissatisfaction, and also low innovation.
When we think of toxic leadership, we see it in two perspectives. First, we look at it from a leader's perspective. Leaders who are following toxic leadership style are only interested in themselves and only care if it's beneficial to them. When we look at ethical leadership, we see it falls into the ethical egoism category, but not exactly. Leaders who follow ethical egoism are selfish, but to the point where it doesn't harm or affect the rights of others. But this leadership is a little twisted in that sense. Toxic leaders will use any means necessary to get benefits. They are heartless and insensitive individuals who don't show positive emotions towards their employees. and think of themselves as higher than them. Toxic leaders degrade their employees by using verbal and psychological methods to demean them, by poking at their mistakes and emotional weaknesses. They're essentially bullying other people under their control. Going back to this course, this relates to positional power, or more precisely, coercive power, where the leader uses his power to punish others. This relates to toxic leadership, as toxic leaders use their power to psychologically torment their workers. They also use their powers to make workers meet ridiculous deadlines and complete impossible tasks. An example of this would be expecting a single worker to complete a task that takes 3 people to complete in half the time it takes them to complete that task. Now that we've covered leadership perspective in the leader's side, let's look at it from a follower's perspective. Due to this leadership, they are required to make sacrifices for the benefit of the leader, such as working longer hours, for getting closer to the leader's goals and ambitions, even if it doesn't get them anything in return. This will be considered narcissism in the transformational leadership style because these leaders are better than everyone else and they have a special ability to impact others. These narcissistic leaders abuse their power for their personal gain. Followers also face interference from their leaders, which impacts their ability to perform. This can be physical or psychological torment from their leader. Some psychological methods toxic leaders use is criticizing everything a follower does wrong to make little mistakes seem big. The followers who want to belong in the group are tempted to follow the leader, even if it may negatively impact them. But as long as they're part of the group, they're satisfied. Now let's look at some statistics on toxic leaders. This study was done by Kenneth Matos on a population of 1,000 employed college-educated students in the range of 18 to 78 of age on leadership of their immediate managers. From this survey, the results showed that an overall of 56 of the population who worked in this toxic environment have been worked in a toxic environment, and 24% of those people were in a highly toxic environment, whereas 32% were in a mildly toxic environment. This study was done in 2017, which is fairly recent, and the population of this study was also in our age range, which means that there is a good chance that we might find ourselves in a toxic environment in the near future.
And on that note, I have some personal experiences to share as regards to toxic leadership and the topic at hand. I worked for a grocery store a while back for a little over a year and received a pretty ample experience of dealing with toxic leaders during my time there. It began when we got a new manager. I had been there about 4 months at the time, and he quickly made it very clear that he really didn't care about our well-being as individuals or whether we were enjoying ourselves. He only cared if we got the work done, preferably as quickly as possible, which meant twice as quickly as could reasonably be expected. There were a few rather unfortunate incidents that took place between workers that resulted in at least one of the parties quitting, which was usually due to the general apathy displayed by upper management. They really didn't seem to care all that much about the problems as long as the work was still getting done. And as a result, more and more workers continued to quit, and the ones of us who were left, the conditions just got worse because we were expected to do the same amount of work as we had been doing before when we had twice as many people. This was with the new management not bringing in any new hires. And as a result, the both physical and mental stress on those of us that were left simply reached a critical mass after a very short period of time, as our manager simply expected us to buckle down and keep going in the face of a situation that was entirely his own fault. And to make matters worse, he didn't do any work himself. He just spent all his time sitting in the office and periodically came out to yell at us for not getting enough work done and seemed to really focus on the ones of us who were actually doing work in this regard.
Now we talk about what are the consequences of toxic leadership that leads to decreased employee morale. That is, toxic leaders can create a negative work environment that can lower the morale of an employee and lead to decreased motivation and productivity. Reduced job satisfaction. Toxic leaders can make employees feel undervalued, underappreciated, and unsupported, which can reduce job satisfaction. Poor communication. Toxic leaders can damage communication channels between team members and employees, leading to misunderstandings and miscommunications, which leads to mistakes in the projects and the workspace. Decrease creativity and innovation. Toxic leaders can stifle creativity and innovation by limiting employees' ability to express themselves and their ideas. Toxic leaders can create a work environment that is highly stressful and can lead to frequent burnouts. Resistance to change. Toxic leaders may almost all the time resist changes that could benefit the organization or its employees and only benefit themselves, which could lead to stagnation and missed opportunities on loads of talent and higher work. Loss of key talent. Toxic leaders may drive away talented employees who are unwilling to work in a negative work environment, leading to loss of key talent and decreased organizational capacity. Now we talk about what can be done to minimize the toxic leadership. First, eliminating or preventing leadership must start with identification. Toxic leaders can be identified during the hiring and promotion process. Some organization businesses need a cultural shift in the way they look and assess performances. Higher employees in leadership positions should communicate, model, and reinforce appropriate leadership behaviors for the business and the workspace. Developing a stronger follower is an important aspect of managing a toxic leadership. Longer probationary period to be put in place for new leadership hires and assigning new leaders executive coaches who can help enlighten their performances as a leader.
Just to pick up where Josefa left off with a few more strategies to minimize toxic leadership, just in the different levels of management. Middle management, in my experience, is usually the key to this because even if your top boss is kind of a jerk, if your supervisor is like just somebody who the workers like working for, who genuinely cares about you and just makes you feel happy when you're in the workplace, that can make a world of difference and help sustain your morale even if your overall situation isn't great. And for like just the standard rank and file of an organization, it's good to make sure to make friends with your coworkers, which definitely helps you maintain a healthy mindset because you can foster a sense of like camaraderie and being part of a team. Like, sure, it's not the best situation, but at least you're all in it together. And for upper management, it's very important for you to remember that you have to be able to balance your concern for the results with your concern for people, like sort of a 5-5 on the leadership grid, as we talked about in class. Because expecting your employees to perform well, that's not exactly an unreasonable demand. That is what they're getting paid for. But you always do have to remember that you should make sure to be somebody who is worthy of their efforts. Because if your employees feel like they're just wasting their time, then, well, they're not exactly going to be motivated to do what you want them to do.
How to deal with toxic leadership. So some ways people can deal with toxic leadership is document everything. So document anything that seems odd or disrespect to any of the employees, so you can let your higher bosses or HR know. Avoid any creating conflict with toxic bosses, as it can cause you to lose your job. Help instead of judge. Focus on the job, not your ego. Clarify, or if none of these work out, you can just always leave the organization. So some possible psychological effects that toxic bosses create and what to do about them. So sometimes a toxic boss or leadership would bring constant fear, anxiety, boredom, and loss of interest, mental fatigue, constantly tired, and loneliness. So to break away from this, you would either you can leave the company or you can start doing well-being action plans like meditation or daily walks. Reflect on the experiences. So when you have a leadership opportunity, you know what not to do, and work more efficiently with your team. So you can just take out the toxicity out of your group and focus on the task at hand.
All right, so just to summarize the key points that we've gone over in our discussion today, just when identifying toxic leaders, traits you can usually look for reliably are selfishness, narcissism, being overly demanding, and of course, being unpredictable, because leaders don't usually walk in and announce themselves like, "Hey, I'm here to ruin your lives," by just kicking you in the face when they walk in the door. They can be very strange like that. And their only concern is for themselves, and they're either indifferent to or the active cause of most or all of their employees' problems, depending on their specific style of toxicity. And if such leaders are left completely unchecked, then they can prove to be seriously detrimental to the well-being of coworkers physically if they're that kind of boss, but more likely psychologically and mentally in terms of just putting an overly excessive amount of stress on employees to get work done in order to avoid the wrath of their boss. And if you find yourself as a worker faced with a toxic leadership situation, there are some fairly reliable strategies to combat it, such as banding together with your fellow workers and just like maintaining solidarity with one another, focusing on your work and personal goals. Focusing on your work and personal goals, like what's really important to you more than what's important to your boss, because that focus and clarity is often good to help you keep a clear mind. Or if all else fails, you do, of course, have the option to simply hand in your 2 weeks' notice and leave, which can often be the best thing for you. Yeah, these are the sources that we used for this project.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thanks.
Now